welcome to Trekosophy, the Star Trek philosophy podcast. We are in our second season, episode 20, recorded on July 24th, 2013. Today we have with us, first and foremost, our fearless leader. He only sold for 2 slips of Latinum on the market, Ben McLean. And our technical guru, he bought Ben for 2 slips of Latinum, Chris McGee. And of course, there's me, the guy in the Orion Slave Girl outfit, Brandon Kirby.
Somehow I don't think Brandon is going to be as successful in manipulation as the actual Orion Slave Girls. I just don't see that happening.
Well, you've never felt the wrath of my attempt at seduction. So, with that, we'll plunge into it.
Alrighty. And in case anyone wondering what the heck we're talking about, we're actually discussing the Enterprise episodes, Season 4, Episode 17, Bound. But we're not just going to be talking about how hot the Orion Slave Girls are, no. We'll actually get some philosophy in here and discuss the whole master-slave dialectic.
Chris, why don't you give us a reading there of the episode Bound, just so we're all brought up to date on what we're discussing?
Certainly. I can give you the Memory Alpha synopsis, which is extremely short, woefully short. While T'Pol and Tucker discover that they have developed a psychic bond, Captain Archer receives 3 Orion slave girls as a gift for negotiating with the devious Orion Syndicate, with rather disastrous results.
Well, it's the disastrous results that we wanted to... Yes,
they're very purposefully vague on that.
You just dun over the best part.
Yeah, and it's not just the consequences for the Enterprise, but it's what we learn about the Orion Syndicate and life in general, or at least what the episode's trying to tell us about life in general. That's, as always in Trekosophy, we read in a whole bunch of crap. No, we think that Star Trek episodes are generally telling us different things about life. And in this case, it's giving us an illustration of some important stuff in Hegel. Brandon, could you give us your synopsis of what George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel is all about?
Why not?
Yes.
But before I do, I just want to point out the important part, and we might want to have a bit of a spoiler alert, because it really is the climax of the episode. The slave women who are traded, it turns out they are named slave women moderately deceptively, because you think they're slaves. They're not. They're actually the slave owners. The men are the slaves. The ones who we think of as the slave traders are themselves the enslaved. They're totally at the mercy of the wishes of the women they're allegedly trading. And that's what was so fascinating, and that had never been brought up or discovered or explored before in Star Trek. And so there was an inversion of the master-slave relationship.
Well, at least not directly. I mean, you could argue different things, even back in the original series, did things that are almost like that, but not quite. Never as clearly as this.
That's true, yeah, and I accept that rebuke. Yeah, that's definitely true. You could argue, you could have given a Hegelian analysis back in the 60s when this concept of the Orion slave girl was first introduced, that the men were enslaved to their desires, much more so than the woman was enslaved. But be that as it may, let me just give a brief philosophical background for Hegel.
Okay, go ahead.
Hegel was obsessed with history, and most philosophers up until that point tended to ignore it. They liked studying things like math or science. But history, it lent itself to things like understanding politics, and that just wasn't something a lot of philosophers have historically don't want to say been interested in, but it was never a focal point.
Well, let me ask you this real quickly. When was Hegel alive? When was he doing this research or whatever?
Hegel? Well, why don't I get you some exact dates?
Should be early to mid 19th century, I think.
Okay. Because when you talk about he's studying history and up to that point, that's why
just after Kant, just before Kierkegaard. If you want the actual years, it's he lived from 1770 to 1831.
Oh, okay. So it's earlier than been thought. Okay.
What? You said till 1841?
1831. He's after.
1831. Oh, okay. So he's early 19th century.
He's after Kant, but before Kierkegaard. Kant died, I think, in 1800, but Hegel was coming into prominence as Kant was on his way out.
Okay, good deal.
I might just say real quickly is that there were certainly many political philosophers throughout the history of philosophy, but Hegel's historicism introduces a new sort of obsession with history, where others tended to do things like in Plato's Republic with his degenerate regimes, they would sort of generalize about the stages that things go through and so on, but they wouldn't. They weren't as obsessed with the actual history as Hegel was.
Well, and I misspoke to say that no one was interested in politics. They were, but not as a guide for illuminating absolute truth. For example, Plato's going to want to take mathematics and make that his model. Plato's interested in politics. He wrote the Republic. That was his big thing. But as a guide towards illuminating truth, Hegel turns to history. And what does he find? He's going to say the whole of history is about humanity having an elevated consciousness of freedom. Take, for example, he'll use Persia as his baseline. It's the hellhole of history. Wait, that word might get edited out. What, dunghill? Crap heap?
The hellhole works.
Hellhole works?
Especially if you're talking about the Congo or something.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it is a hellhole.
Prior to Persia, everything's just awful. And it's at this putrid, awful level. But Greece rebels. And freedom is no longer for one person, the ruler of Persia. It's for a couple more people, the aristocracy. Rome starts to codify individual freedoms, and so it becomes a matter of formality. But there's still a lot of tyranny. Rome is still all about force. Christianity comes along and improves things even more, especially via opposing the ethics of slavery. Because in Christianity, every individual has infinite value. There's an eternality of the individual in the Christian scheme of things. And this is essentially the justification for freedom. You can't treat people as they're just means to your end, because they're just as valuable as our ends. The drive for freedom, going from Persia to Greece to Rome, is all about our discovering the transcendental or the eternal nature of the human soul. It's about discovering our eternal worth. But then there was a problem. And it comes in the form of Constantine. The church is corrupt. There's this brief flourishing of the individual, but then the church captures it, and the eternal is encapsulated in material or temporal forms. Let me give you an example. You've got statues, icons, symbols, ceremonies, regular observances. And these temporal things, these material things, become the focus. Hegel hated Catholicism. In tyrannical rules, rulers were still able to rule, but under the banner of Christianity. And so they took this enormous drive towards freedom and they perverted it and they made it base again and took the focus off of the eternal onto the temporal, and that allowed for the despotism to continue. One of the high points of human history is the Reformation, a German invention, no less. No longer is an outside authority needed to have a relationship with God. Every individual can do this on their own. And I think it was Peter Sanger who said, the Reformation unfurls the banner of the free spirit. And I think that pretty much sums up Hegel in a nutshell. The French Revolution does the same thing, but not on a religious level, on a political level. So again, like these pivotal moments in human history where freedom begins to flourish. So, in short, you've got, how did I put it, the elevation of the awareness of freedom. Then we go to slavery. Again, their use is means towards an end. Slaves aren't seen as having value in and of themselves. And we find out in Enterprise the slave women are themselves not slaves because their ends were the ones that were pursued. In Enterprise, the slave women had been using the traders as means to their end. And as such, we who had traditionally and superficially thought of the slave women as the enslaved turned out to be the slave owners.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Ben.
Oh, well, I think it might be a good way to put this if we put it in terms of needs versus wants. Right.
Before you do that, Ben, real quickly, I want to mention that, to be fair, in the episode, it was given, well, like so many other Star Trek episodes, it was given a more science fiction spin in that, it was not just the fact that the slaves are actually the masters. It's, they have a certain pheromone that's causing the men to behave in this way. It's causing them to do whatever the women want.
Yeah, the trouble is real women have natural pheromones,
but
they're not
supposedly
as powerful as
not
the
as
science
powerful,
fiction ones,
exactly.
but they do have them.
They do have them, but in addition, it wasn't necessarily, well, it may have been for the slave girls' ends, but all we could tell from the episode is that they were trying to do this for some other Orion person that we never even saw. That whatever his name was, the Orion master, Harad Sar, something like that, he was actually doing this for some other guy because the Enterprise crew had a bounty on their heads. So he was enslaved by the women, not for the women's ends necessarily, but for some other Orions that wanted to collect on the bounty on the Enterprise crew. But anyway, that's just a side note.
According to Roxar, isn't that guy's name Roxar?
Harad Sar.
Harad Sar, that's it. According to Harad Sar, what's been revealed here is the underlying structure of all of Orion society.
Yeah, it could be very true, yes.
At least that is what he is saying when he says that the men are the slaves in the Orion society. But I was going to say about the master-slave dialectic and how it works. It might be a good way to understand it if we put it in terms of needs and wants.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
The masters want the slaves, and the slaves don't want the masters. So, but the slaves have the masters. So it appears that the masters have the power. But the masters need the slaves, and the slaves don't need the masters. And So that raises the question, who is really in control of who? Because the people who are actually needed, if they're gone, the whole system doesn't work. So Hegel is trying to get us to be a little bit more suspicious of power relations and not take them at face value. This isn't to say that the slaves are completely free to do whatever they want, because they clearly aren't. But it does say that when someone depends on you, you have a certain degree of power over them, regardless of the economic relations between you. And one of the best examples of this that I've seen is the student-teacher relationship. Like in grade school, this is not nearly so clear because the parents are the one, the parents are involved. So there's three aspects instead of just, student and teacher. There's student, teacher, and parent, and that makes it a little less clear. But once you get to the university level, where the parents are no longer involved and it's just the students and the teachers, then this starts to operate because the students are paying money to the university to get the teachers. So in that sense, the teachers are employees of the students. But the teachers set requirements that the students have to complete. And so the students are trying to get something from the teachers, right? And in a sense, it looks like the teacher is in charge. The teachers are in charge of all the students, right? Because the students will do whatever the teachers say. But the students are the ones paying the teacher's salary. So who is it that's really in charge?
It sounds to me like more of a symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, and that's what the master-slave dialectic kind of is.
Okay.
In a sense, at least that's how I would look at it. Is that the master-slave dialectic is sort of revealing that the master-slave relation is a symbiotic relation, which goes both ways, not just one way.
Right. Exactly.
And that there are abundant opportunities for slaves or employees or students or what have you to manipulate those they are supposedly serving.
Both sides give up something to get something else, essentially.
They do. And it's not that it's an equal relationship of power, but in some cases it goes inverted in this weird and unexpected way. And Hegel shows this where I don't think anyone in the past really saw it. Do you know of anyone, Brandon?
Well, it has to do with who's alerted to what more than anything. Because there's that Marxist element there of the enslaved are really the producers, and so therefore they're really the ones empowered. Yeah, I mean that's certainly true, but there's also the notion of what Hegel is going to talk about in terms of the rest of his philosophy. Really, you're going to see this in Plato too. The men in the Enterprise episode just weren't thinking clearly. And that's important. Because for Hegel, coming to knowledge, absolute knowledge, is the exact same thing as freedom. It's this drive towards recognizing the self as eternal. You've got epistemology prior to Hegel, where people are trying to understand knowledge. For Hegel, it's just understanding that the mind is the thing worth getting to know. For him, the realization that history is moving in a certain direction, and that philosophically he's discovered that human beings are moving in the direction of themselves, the self getting to know itself, which is bizarre and as esoteric as that sounds. He considers his own writings to be the high point in humanity, somewhat egotistical. But the reason why the slaves are not the ones who are genuinely enslaved is precisely because the slave traders are consumers going around trying to pursue their desires, whereas the slaves have some measure of self-awareness. The medieval poor, aware of who they are, aware of what's going on, with somewhat more genuine social interactions. And for that reason, the men who are just completely enslaved by lust in the Enterprise episode, not clear thinkers, not really aware of what's going on, are not mentally cognizant. And so they're not really participating in this drive towards freedom, because there's just no understanding. And that's not the case with the slave women, who are really the empowered. They know exactly what's going on. They know exactly what they want. They know exactly how to get it. They're being very clear-headed about going in that direction.
It occurs to me that something, I don't have the reference in front of me, but didn't Paul in the New Testament say something about being free even though he's a prisoner? Or was that Paul? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I do.
And I mean, I don't know. It just seems like Hegel might be playing off of that in some sense. And perhaps the Star Trek writers as well, in a way. Just that idea of this bizarre antithesis of freedom and imprisonment or slavery. Anyway, where were we?
He viewed himself
Sorry.
as a slave to Christ, and then thought of himself as completely free.
Yeah, but
I let me see if I can take another attempt at clarifying this confusing thought in my head. For Hegel, realizing your spirit is the same thing as the drive towards freedom. So the forces of history are the same forces in Christianity, and the slaves would be much nearer towards self-realization than a slave trader would be. It'd be like the C.S. Lewis in Abolition of Man, the one who's totally enamored with technology has lost himself, whereas the slave isn't really.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's I don't know if that's a fair characteristic of what Lewis said.
They're enamored with technology.
They're enamored with
man because they've become animals, because they're totally driven by desire.
They've made technology and progress their summum bonum. I mean, Lewis is not opposed to seeing technology as very important, but rather he's saying that if you make it your number one, then you end up being enslaved by it, which is a common theme running throughout most of science fiction. All that stuff about the robot rebellions and so on. Well,
Chris,
if we're done with Hegel, we might want to, and we have extra time, we might want to also talk about the implications of the episode for ideas about feminism and patriarchy and so on.
Well, there's a friend of mine. She's a really interesting woman. She works as a nude model, stripper, but she's deeply philosophical. And she sees it as something empowering, like the slave woman, because there's an inversion where she's doing X, Y, and Z for their money, working for them, but in reality, they're the ones enslaved. They're the ones who have to go to her.
Yeah.
And so she sees it as something that she's using to enslave other people.
The thing is, though, that is not just true of prostitution, but I would argue that that is true of traditional female roles in supposedly patriarchal societies in general. I mean, as patriarchal as you want societies to get, I rather think that if the patriarch's wife is upset with him, she's not going to sleep with him, and there's going to be problems. So he's not going to want to do anything that's going to upset her. No matter how patriarchal the structure of the society is, that effect is going to be true on some level. So there's always been a kind of check or balance on patriarchy, no matter when in history it was or what the structure of society was.
Right. Well, I think not the project of feminism, but some sort of a goal would be that they have other means of empowerment outside of not sleeping with the patriarch.
Sure, but it's not just
admirable.
that. That was sort of an example, not necessarily I didn't mean just that. But if you are, a patriarch and you upset the women in general, you're going to have problems. I mean, no matter what the structure of your society is, and this needs to be taken into account in feminist narratives, and it often isn't. I'm not saying that. I mean, there certainly has been throughout history a lot of men abusing women. That certainly happened a lot, and it's been wrong and terrible. And so there are a lot of legitimate things that feminists have to say. On the other hand, though, they have taken a very limited view of the role of the traditional housewife and so on, that doesn't really match what the reality in history has been. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's not as simple that the housewife is just a house slave who just does whatever her husband says and doesn't have her own life or whatever. It's not that simple.
Right. Where you'd watch the episode and you'd think, oh, there's a bunch of women who are enslaved. No, not so much. Whereas you'd look at history and you'd say women have been oppressed. Well,
they have been.
There are complex power relations that have been going on throughout history that were mirrored in the episode that make us want to question appearances.
That's what I'm saying. And bringing this up can make you very unpopular very fast because, like a lot of things in philosophy, there's two things philosophers do way too much, and that is make suicide sound like a really good idea and blame the victim. And if you get upset by either of those things being the appearance at face value, then don't come to philosophy class. If you're considering suicide, don't come to philosophy class, because in philosophy class they're going to ask, well, is death actually a bad thing? And questions like that. And it's the same thing with certain things about feminism. There are certain things in philosophy that you might not want to hear. Because while there are true and legitimate grievances that many women have and have had for ages and so on, it's also true that the relations of power have been a lot more complex than they might appear at face value, and that I think the role of women has been in history a lot more powerful, if not prominent, than our mostly male-dominated history would suggest. I rather, and it's like they say, behind every great man is a great woman.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably true for the most part, and I think a lot of those women have had a lot more to do with setting policy than history books at face value would suggest. For instance, you look at John Adams and Abigail Adams. Abigail was certainly not without influence in the politics of the United States because she wrote back and forth with John all the time, and John had to take her ideas seriously. And if he didn't, then he was in some serious trouble. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, I do.
It's the first I've heard of her.
Oh, yeah. Well, Abigail Adams, very important to John Adams. If you ever read a biography of John Adams and you don't find out all about Abigail, then your biographer has got to be a total failure.
Yeah, see, I don't read biographies, that's why.
Well, okay. One thing I'm looking at it now. I'm in my living room, which means I'm surrounded by science fiction paraphernalia. And my wife recently made me this clock where it's 12 women of sci-fi, and they're all numerically significant. For example, Model 6 is 6 o'clock, 7 of 9 is 7 o'clock. Dax, Jadzia Dax was Dax's 8th host. Anyways, it's a real innovative concept. And with the exception of Troy, they're all very intelligent women. The thing that I find wonderful about science fiction is that it has empowered women into what would be traditionally male roles. Whoopi Goldberg was once inspired to become an actress by Uhura, who said, "Mom, Dad, come quick. There's a black woman on TV and she ain't no maid. She's doing what would be thought of as a male role." And now I find this episode, Bound, really turns up the voltage because it looks at something that a lot of us would see as an oppressed role, maternity, for example, and it empowers it. Where you have a lot of feminists saying we need more women in the sciences, and then all of a sudden you have some feminists reacting to that saying, actually, no, we need to have more respect for midwives. I find that there's so many wonderful philosophical elements that get reflected in this episode. I find it inspiring.
Okay, well, I'm thinking we're getting close to the end of our time here, so any final thoughts?
Chris, what about you? You watched the episode. What did you think?
I thought it was interesting. Like I had mentioned earlier, I thought that, of course, they gave it the sci-fi spin so that it wasn't, just a look into Hegel. I mean, they only brought that up for like 1 minute at the end, if that.
Well, the whole episode sets it up, though. I mean, that's how most philosophy stories
with the sci-fi spin
work.
About the superpowered pheromones. It was interrupting Phlox's sleep cycle. It was doing, all these other things.
Well, I really think that the sci-fi spin is just amping up something that is in real life. It's taking something in real life and then taking it to an extreme. And you have to do that to illustrate a point. I mean, that's how points are illustrated, is quite often by taking them to an extreme.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
Like, there's a lot of people who criticize Ayn Rand's novel, Atlas Shrugged, because it has cardboard, simple black and white characters. But that's the point. I mean, that's really a dumb criticism because it misses the point of the characters is to illustrate simple black and white ideas. They're taken to an extreme because it makes the point the author wants to make. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so and of course I think the philosophy serves the story, and the story in some ways serves the philosophy. In fact, there might even be a Hegelian analysis of that we could do.
Okay, let's not get too meta here.
All right.
All right, then.
You want me to take us out?
Let's do it.
Well, thank you for listening. Don't forget to check us out on the web, Trekosophy.com, or on Facebook, Facebook.com/Trekosophy, or on Twitter, #Trekosophy, or email us to just let us know you think Ben's a real piece of work, Trekosophy@gmail.com. Leave us a review on iTunes. Don't hesitate to click on the donate box on Trekosophy.com. Join us next week if you feel so inclined. I want to thank the hosts, Chris, Ben. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
And never look an Orion slave girl in the mouth. A gift slave girl in the mouth. She'll breathe her pheromones on you.
Oh, good heavens. Good advice.
Have we already started the episode?
I think Kant is overused.
We didn't even mention, what was it, Foucault or whatever?
Foucault.
I thought someone had mentioned they wanted to bring that up about this too.
What is that?
I have no idea.
Oh.
I was really just looking for an excuse to watch the Orion Slave Girl episode again.
Well, let's pick something that, Brandon, if Bill joins us, we can do a three, with him, Bill, Brandon. I can't talk anymore. No more bourbon for me.
Don't ever say that.
It is rated P for philosophy students only.
I gotta get back on that train of thought. I gotta get back on the train. The train crashed.
Yeah, take your time.
I'm rebuilding the pieces.
We just got through a whole episode of turning Orion slave girls into philosophy. I mean, it's just, wow, this is quite an achievement for...
Well, I almost said something really cocky when you asked me, so Chris, what did you think of the episode right at the end? I was toying with the idea of saying, well, I think those girls were really hot.